hit Okay. Thanks very much, Mariah. Take it away.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mary Beth and the Scotch Plains Library for having me. I love talking about this book with readers. So I'm going to do my talk about how I came to this story and why it's important for Women's History Month. And then hopefully we can have a lively discussion. And if there's time, I will read a little bit. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this is going to work beautifully. Okay. All right. So for those of you who have not spent the last 3 years obsessing about this case, the basics are that on March 1st, 1932, the 20-month-old son of Charles and Anne Morrow Lindbergh was kidnapped from the family home in Hopewell, New Jersey. And since then, more than 30 books have been written about the case and its aftermath. And it's fair to ask, did the world really need another book? But most of those books focus on the marquee names, the Lindberghs or Bruno Richard Hauptmann. But there were other people involved, and these were people on whom the crime had a lasting and devastating impact. As a writer, I'm keenly interested in the stories of overlooked women. My mystery series is the Jane Prescott Lady's Maid series, and I love the staff's point of view. And in recent years, we've seen a lot of books delving into the lives of women who have been ignored by history, such as Piper Huguley's By Her Own Design about the dress designer Anne Lowe, or women who've been overshadowed to some extent by the more famous men in their lives, such as the Paris wife or the aviator's wife. So when my publisher asked me to write a historical standalone, my first thought was to find an overlooked woman in a true crime. And as so many flailing mystery writers do, I thought of Agatha Christie. What would she do with this story? And that's when I remembered Murder on the Orient Express. Murder on the Orient Express. Slide, whoop, no, there. Like a lot of people, my first impression of the Lindbergh kidnapping came from Murder on the Orient Express. And if you remember the 1974 movie, it opens with a silent scene of the kidnapping of little Daisy Armstrong. And as the kidnapper makes his way through the darkened house, which they put in Long Island instead of New Jersey for some reason, it's not really the parents who encounter him, it's the servants, most notably the nanny, who is seen tied to a chair on the floor, unable to protect the baby. And I knew that Christie had been inspired by the Lindbergh case. The book was published 2 years after the kidnapping, but interestingly, before they caught Hauptmann. And I wondered, well, who was that nurse? Was she a Christie invention or was she a real person? And a quick Google search revealed that yes, she was a real person. This is Betty Dow, seen here with Charlie and one of the family dogs. And this was one of the first images that I saw of Betty, and I couldn't tell who was this woman. From this image, it's hard to tell her personality. It's taken from a distance. It looks like she's scowling. A lock of hair is in her face. She feels a little bit caught. And as I later found out, there's a reason for that. But the photograph left it ambiguous. If I was going to write the kidnapping from this woman's point of view, what kind of character do I have? Was this a heroine? Was she a villain? Was she a dupe? somewhat sexistly, I decided that the best place to learn about the baby's nurse was through the baby's mother. And so my first book that I read was Susan Hertog's excellent biography of Anne Morrow Lindbergh. And that's where I learned that Betty Gow lived for a very long time, long enough to be interviewed by Hertog and A. Scott Berg, who was Lindbergh's biographer. And Betty had very sharp views on the Lindberghs, and she liked very much. Colonel Lindbergh, not so much. Anne's feelings about Betty are a little harder to decipher. Shortly after the Lindberghs hired Betty, Anne wrote to her mother-in-law, and she said, "I think this Scotch girl is very good and would take perfect care of the baby and know when to call for the doctor, etc. But you see, she and Elsie and Whately have had very little experience with publicity and reporters. They have none of them been over here very long, and so are not so familiar with many USA customs. The baby is not quite in the same position as most other babies. The house is rather unprotected." Elsie and Whately is a reference to a married couple that the Lindberghs hired to take care of the house when they were away, which was pretty often. Now, to me, the first thing that's interesting about Anne's letter is the level of anxiety. A full year before her son is kidnapped, she's intensely aware of threat. The house is unprotected. Reporters are lurking. What does she mean by USA customs? And you can put some of this down to the fears of a new mother who's or a young woman who's only recently married into the very harsh glare of public fascination. And I also learned later that Anne's youngest sister had just been the target of a kidnapping threat. The other thing that was interesting to me is that Anne doesn't use Betty's name. She's this Scotch girl. So who was this Scotch girl before she was hired by the Lindberghs? The bare facts of Betty Gow's life are revealed in Mark Falzini's Their 15 Minutes of Fame. Mr. Falzini is the now retired archivist of the New Jersey State Police Museum. And if anybody knows more about this case, I would be completely amazed. And when I was writing this book during COVID, he was unbelievably generous, going back and forth with me via email and answering questions. From his book, I learned that Betty Gow was born in Glasgow in 1904. She has 5 brothers and sisters. Her mother will be reported as saying, "Betty is my oldest child." She will also be reported as saying, "Betty is my youngest child." And you have no idea how much effort I've had to put into finding out which one it was. Betty leaves school at 14. She has various jobs, mostly in a boot store, shoe store. She comes to America in 1929 following her older brother. Sorry, her older brother gave it away. She has several nanny positions. None of them seem to last very long. At one point, she goes to Detroit to look up an old boyfriend from Scotland. That doesn't end well either. And in February of 1931, she is hired by the Lindberghs to look after Charlie. And just a year later, Charlie is kidnapped, and Betty will be the last person to see him alive. Now, one of the first things that you notice about this story is that everyone has more than one name, either because of nicknames or family names that they don't use in America, misspellings by the press or the police. Betty Gow is also Bessie Gow, is also Bessie Mowat. Her boyfriend, Henry Johnson, is known as Red or Henrik. Charles Lindbergh is Lucky Lindy, the Lone Eagle. Later in Germany, when he has several other families that result in children, the children are told that he's an American by the name of Carew, Kent. Violet Sharp, a table made for the Morrows, is also Violet Payne due to a bogus marriage. Ellerson, the chauffeur, is called Ellison. Even little Charlie is the Eaglet or wee Lindy. And for a while, I thought Anne Laurel Lindbergh was the one person in this whole story with a straightforward name and identity. And then I realized she's both Morrow and Lindbergh, the identity she was born with and the one she took on when she married Colonel Lindbergh. And the duality is right there. But the reason that everyone in this story has more than one name is they have more than one identity. There's public and private. Charles Lindbergh famously goes from being one of the most admired Americans in the 20th century to one of the more reviled Americans from that era, from the lone eagle to the bootlicker of Hitler, in the words of Robert Sherwood. And when I was first looking at Betty Gow, I wondered, did she have any public identity? Did people know who she was? If she was just a note in a police file, interviewed Nanny as to what the baby was wearing, that wasn't going to give me much of a story. But as I discovered when I went into the newspaper archives, she was not just a note in a police file. Betty's second names are many. She is the Lindbergh nurse, a second mother to the little fellow. She's also possibly an associate of Scotty Gow, a Detroit gangster. As you can see, the media have a field day with her. Most importantly and ominously, early on, she is reported to be she who left unlocked the shutters that through which the kidnappers entered the baby's room. Not only did she leave the shutters unlocked, she left a window open as well. And when she put the baby to bed, she dressed him warmly, even making him an extra shirt on the spot so he would have another layer. And when the police arrived 25 minutes after Charlie is discovered missing, they strongly suspect the kidnappers had to be working with somebody on the inside. And their very first suspect is Betty Gow. Now, the reason that the police believe that the kidnappers had inside help is that the Lindberghs were not supposed to be in Hopewell that night. For all intents and purposes, they didn't really live there because the house was still under construction and they were still living with Anne's mother in Englewood. But they did spend weekends there. But anyone watching the house would have seen that the Lindberghs were not there during the week. March 1st was a Tuesday, and it was the first Tuesday they had ever spent in Hopewell. And it was a last-minute decision made because Charlie had caught a cold, and the way mothers do, Anne caught the cold from Charlie. So she was pregnant at the time, exhausted, and she calls Betty down from Englewood to help. And that phone call was the first time that the family's whereabouts were made known outside the immediate family itself. So who knew about that phone call? Well, this is Ollie Whately, the butler, the butler all-purpose handyman for the Lindberghs. He makes the call from the Hopewell house, and he and his wife Elsie know. Violet Sharp, a table maid for the Morrows in Englewood, is there when Betty takes the call. Betty asks the butler, Septimus Banks, if a driver can take her because she doesn't want to take the train. So he knows. And there's a snag. Betty had a date that night. Over the summer, she starts dating a Norwegian sailor, Henry Johnson, but he's about to leave town to live with his brother in Connecticut because he's broke. She calls his landlady and leaves a message to say she can't make it because she has to go to Hopewell. Also going on that date was a Moro seamstress, Marguerite Janssen, and her husband Johannes, who was recently arrived from Germany. She's very distressed to hear that Betty cannot come out with them that night. Finally, Betty has Ellerson, the chauffeur, drive her to Hopewell. So we have the nurse, the butler, the maid, the caretakers, the chauffeur, the seamstress, and the boyfriend. It really does read exactly as Agatha Christie wrote it. Betty arrives at the Hopewell house at around 1:30. At 8, she puts Charlie to bed. At 8:10, Anne Lindbergh thinks she hears a car approach the house. But it's not until 8:25 that she hears Colonel Lindbergh honk the horn and drive into the garage. According to Anne, the couple has dinner. At 8:10, Charles draws her a bath and then goes down to his study, which is directly beneath Charlie's nursery. Betty has her dinner and talks with Elsie Whately. Henry calls her from a payphone at 8:35. He says, I could delay going to my brother's. She says, no, you go. Then at 10, as she always does, she goes to check on Charlie, and he's gone. On the windowsill, there's a small white envelope and a ransom note. The police are called at 10:25, and from that moment on, the staff of both the Lindbergh and the Morrow households come under intense suspicion. By the time the investigation has ended, one person commits suicide, another had a breakdown and was institutionalized, a third died a little more than a year later, and a fourth just disappeared. A fifth never really recovered. Private lives were turned inside out, and false narratives were created. Long-held secrets appeared in the newspapers. Murder on the Orient Express takes its inspiration from not just the kidnapping, but the terrible impact it had on the family and the people who worked for them. So let's go back to this picture. This is Betty's very first appearance in the newspaper, and it was taken by a photographer who had followed her and Charlie to his grandparents' home in North Haven, Maine. The Lindberghs really did not want Charlie growing up in the spotlight, and they had taken precautions to protect him from the press. Betty wasn't even allowed to take him to the beach in New Jersey because it was really seen as too public. He traveled to Maine under the name of Mary, but the cameras found him anyway. And that explains the angry, wary look. Charles Lindbergh has the Spirit of St. Louis hanging in the Smithsonian, and so he should. But there's no monument to Betty Gow or the millions of caregivers like her. Their lives and voices can be lost, even when they're connected to a famous crime. We impose our own narratives on them during their lifetime and afterwards. Someone's actual character and personality can be very hard to fathom in the distance of nearly a century. The reasons for what they do, the mistakes they make, are hard to decipher. There were some things that made me feel that Betty was perhaps guilty of being the inside person. She bitterly resented the Lindberghs at times. She did not make some great choices regarding her boyfriend. But criminal investigations and murder mysteries put everyone under a very harsh light. And because so many lives have been harmed through distortion after the kidnapping, my portrait of Betty really strove to put Betty's voice at the center. I read her interviews with Hertog and Berg. I read her police interviews and statements, her trial testimony, and her letters home. She was a clearly intelligent, witty, and at times highly defended woman. She knew what was correct, and she was not going to be bossed. But she was also a young woman who had to go out parking with her two boyfriends, even to the point where they got busted by the police once for indecent behavior. In short, she was very human. And I could see how one witness would describe her as distraught on the night of the kidnapping. And a police officer said, she was the coolest of the lot. Her police interview was how I actually found out that she was the youngest of 6. But there was one aspect of her character that was very, very clear. And not only was it noted by the Lindberghs and others who knew Betty, but she made it clear in her own words. And that was her love for Charlie. And so I'd like to give the microphone to her at the end. 3 days after he was kidnapped, Betty wrote to her mother back in Glasgow. Dear Mother, you will have heard long ago about this terrible thing that has happened to us. It is the most cruel thing I ever knew. The object is evidently ransom in a big way, and in that case, they will take good care of him. I hope to goodness we have him back by the time you get this letter. I just feel numbed and terribly lost without that darling. I love him so. All right. I'm going to stop the share at this point. And if people have questions, we can start the chat, or I could read a little bit. I'm happy to do either. Do I read for a bit?
Yeah.
Yeah, seems good. Okay. I will read the scene in which Betty meets Charlie. As Emerson brings the car around the back of the house, I see a man digging by the hedge at the far end of the garden. It's hard work. He jabs at the earth, pitching the dirt aside. He's wearing an olive green sweater, and it takes me a moment to place him as Mr. Banks, the butler with the powdered cheek and withering look. February is a strange time to be planting, and the butler makes a strange gardener. But before I can ask about it, I'm greeted at the back door by Kathleen Sullivan. Let's get you settled in, she says as I get out. Ellerson, take Miss Gow's suitcase to the second floor. Junior's old room, he asks, and she nods. Junior, I'm unsure if she means the baby or someone else. Mrs. Lindbergh's younger brother. He's away at college. Let's start with the laundry room. You'll be spending a fair amount of time there. Following, I feel someone's missing. Will Mrs. Lindbergh be joining us? She looks over her shoulder. I did say you should learn not to expect them. In the laundry room, Mrs. Sullivan shows me the soap and how to launder the baby's diapers, where his pram is kept, and how to dress him for outdoors. In the kitchen, she shows me how to wash his dishes properly, and I am introduced to the family dog, a black terrier named Peter. I give him a pat and notice there are 2 dog bowls on the floor, 2 leashes on a peg. I'm about to ask about the other dog when she says briskly, shall we meet the baby? Oh, yeah, yes, please. As we head upstairs to the nursery, she tells me in a low voice that he naps at midday. Bedtime is 7 p.m., but he is to be woken up and set on the potty at 10 o'clock. Between the hours of 7 and 10, he is to be left strictly alone. What if he cries? I ask. Then he cries. It's silly, I tell myself, to be nervous over meeting a baby. But some take to you right away, and some don't, and some never do. It's a test, this first meeting. No one will say so, but it is. If young Master Lindbergh fusses, goes rigid when I pick him up, if I look upset or unsure of myself. With a careful twist, Mrs. Sullivan turns the doorknob and lets me into a large, airy room filled with sunlight. I hear hello and take in an older woman standing by a handsome crib. From the silver hair and pearls around her neck, I know this is Mrs. Morrow. lady of the house, senator's wife, grandmother. Right away, she extends her hand, gives mine a good shake. The baby is sitting at the center of a blue oval rug, dressed in a white romper. Scattered around him are wooden blocks with letters on them and a dog on wheels with leather ears and a pull string. Arms in the air, he's crowing and growling to himself, making his plans. He's about the size of a bed pillow and soft like one, a little bundle. Maybe it's his smallness, the way he's all alone on that rug with everyone standing in the distance in this large room. Or maybe it's his noises, the pleasure he takes in the world of toys around him. I immediately want to catch him up and hold him close. Isn't he a lamb? I breathe. Mrs. Morrow smiles. That's what my daughter calls him, my fat lamb. It's the curls. His hair is baby blonde, almost white, like soap bubbles all over his head. I kneel at the end of the rug. Charlie notices and goes still. He doesn't like it. So I move back. His feet are bare. I notice the toes on his right foot overlap. What? Not completely perfect. Well, me neither, so we've got that in common. I think of starting with this little piggy, but decide better not until he's more comfortable with me. At the moment, his chief concern seems to be getting hold of a block that's out of reach. He reaches out a chubby hand, bending forward slightly, frustrated there's so much space between him and that block. I pick it up and hold it out to him. For a moment, he stares at me, then puts his fingers alongside mine. When he starts to pull, I hold on to see what he'll do. When he frowns, I let it drift toward him until his brow clears. Then I gently pull it back, making it tug of war back and forth between us. Finally, he gets the block, and I give a big scrunchy grin. We make a tower with the blocks. We knock that down. We make another tower, and we knock that down too, laughing as the blocks scatter across the floor. Charlie and I become a we very fast. I ask Charlie if he will show me his favorite parts of his grandmother's garden. Mrs. Morrow thinks it's an excellent idea, but I can feel her watching me as I dress him for outside. I do it quickly, giving him no time to fuss. He's not happy that he can't move his arms freely in all the layers, and his face crumples. I lift him up high and ask, which doggy shall we take for a walk? Peter doggy or wooden doggy? Which one, hey? He grins and puts a finger in his mouth. After our walk, Mrs. Morrow takes Charlie, and Kathleen Sullivan shows me my room, which is connected to the nursery by a small bathroom. I go to the window and pull aside the curtain. From here, you get some sense of how large the estate is. Mrs. Sullivan points out a building in the distance and tells me it's a school started by Mrs. Lindbergh's sister, Elizabeth. The family hopes Charlie will go there next fall. Looking down, I see the long hedge, the spot where the butler was digging. One part of the earth is turned over, the dirt patted down, a patch of dark brown amid the sparse winter green. It's a grave, I realize, and remember the extra leash.
Good.
So that's our happy introduction to Charlie.
I don't understand. You said that he was supposed to be alone from 7 in the morning until 10?
No, when he was put to bed, they left
Oh.
him alone. So I think it was a little
night.
bit like our cry it out.
Oh, okay.
Approach.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Somebody wrote a sleep book about that to let the kids cry.
Right. Right.
It sounds like she really loved him.
Yes, yes. Yes, as I say, when you start researching someone that's been ignored for nearly a century, you don't know what you're going to get. And nearly every character in the book was complicated. And, I went here as to the inside person, I went there. But they were all quite interesting individuals.
Yeah. The butler. I love that.
Yeah.
Their dinner. I can see why suspicion would form on each and every one of these people who worked at this household.
Yeah, you could write, and many people have written different versions of this story. Lord knows. So
very interesting.
thank you.
Yeah.
I'm happy to answer any questions about the research of the book, or if people have thoughts they'd like to share, or as if you all live in New Jersey, if you have information, I'd be interested to hear it.
Research. How many years did you spend researching this book?
I spent about 1.5 years. I started with the biographies of Charles and Anne because I viewed it primarily as a domestic tragedy.
Oh, each one had a biography. Okay.
Yeah, and Anne, of course, wrote several books, Gift from the Sea, and we have her diary and her memoirs and her letters. The diary that she has concerning this time is called Hour of Gold, Hour of Lead. And it's really a remarkable document because she was, even in the midst of what had to be absolutely unfathomable grief, meticulous about recording what it was like to go through such a thing. So I would really recommend that to anybody who's interested in knowing more about her perspective on the case. And one of the things that she says, there's a theory about Charlie that something was wrong with Charlie because she flew while she was pregnant. And that's
while she was pregnant?
She flew. She was Lindbergh's radio operator. One person said, "Oh, well, Mrs. Lindbergh, you shouldn't be near the plane or whatever." And he said, "Well, yes, she's my wife, but she's crew." And she recounts a visit to the pediatrician, like any new mom is very, very nervous about Charlie's development, and is this all right, and is he hitting these milestones? And he says, "Mrs. Lindbergh, please don't worry, your baby is fine." And
he overlapped toes. I read something.
He did have a hammer toe, yeah.
Oh, is that what they?
That's how Betty was the one who they asked to identify the body.
Right.
Because they didn't want to subject the mother, and that is how she was able to identify him.
Because the head was crushed. Yeah. So how do you integrate all this information as you read this biography, then another one, then you read letters? How do you integrate all that into your writing?
Well, by telling it first person, if it's all Betty's perspective, that gives you one sort of lens that you can't go too far beyond. And I felt very fortunate that she was so involved with the case throughout. There were some things of both Charles and Anne's childhood that I could really only hint at because it would not be known to Betty. And I wrestled, of course, with whether or not to introduce his involvement in America First, and his views,
Mhm.
because by the last time that she saw him was January 1935. She really only spent time with Charles Lindbergh in 1932. But in the end, I felt it would not be fair to stress it too much. So I stuck pretty closely to what he actually did and said at the time. But in the final scene, you do get some hint of it, because I thought readers, it will feel unfair not to discuss it at all.
Right. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Thank you.
Yeah. And was she was obviously exonerated, right? But when they found Hauptmann,
She was. Hauptmann's lawyer tried very hard to continue to sort of cloud the issue. And her testimony was, at first she couldn't testify as scheduled. She was too nervous. And I don't want to give the whole story is in the book, but it was so grueling for her that when she got off the stand, she fainted. So yeah, and she continued to get a lot of very, very ugly mail. She received, thousands of letters saying, I mean, this is according to her mother, accusing her. I mean, people were very upset that, the child of America's hero.
I know, and they're always looking for a scapegoat. But did she explain why she had the windows open the night of the kidnapping? Was it just an innocent thing? She liked fresh air. She thought fresh air was good for the baby.
Anne liked to leave the window open a crack, and one of the shutters would not latch. The wood was warped.
Wow.
So they couldn't, but even the fact that she had made him an extra sleep suit became incriminating, because people thought, she knew he was going to be outside, so she put something more. At this time, many kids, it was a boom time for kidnappings. I mean, it was seen in the Depression as a way to
because of the Depression, right?
Easy money. But a lot of the children came back safe. So the theory went that Betty was nearing 30. Her boyfriend was broke, and that basically she had colluded with him in order to get money so that he could marry her, and in the belief that Charlie would be returned safe. That was the narrative in the newspapers.
Interesting.